the word, oh, okay. Uh,
I'm sorry. Father Brendan, would you mind if I recorded this, or would you rather us not?
it's fine. It's up to you. Yeah, that's fine with me.
Okay.
Is,
I-
is, is everyone else okay with that?
Yeah, I was going to ask that. Everyone okay? It will not be mass produced or anything like that. I just kind of want to keep it for posterity.
Sure. Yeah, it's fine with me.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So to recap for the recording very briefly, wisdom and word, one and the same. Wisdom as a person of the Trinity, living aspect of divine expression, um, deeply rooted in the Alexandrian tradition. Okay, so here Saint Hildegard says, the word is living, being, spirit, all verdant greening, all creativity. The word manifests itself in every creature. So the term in Latin that Saint Hildegard uses here, which she used frequently in her writings and in her teachings, which is translated in English here as two words, verdant greening, which is kind of redundant. One is descriptive and one is active, but nonetheless, it's a little redundant, verdant greening. But the Latin term that Saint Hildegard uses is veriditas. Veriditas. And this is a lovely term that is worth exploring more. But this idea that she's lifting up is that the logos, right, word logos, we could also say the Christ, and we could also say Sophia, wisdom, is living, dynamic, being. This is interesting that she's separated these concepts, living and being. And I think what she's gesturing toward here is something more akin to what St. Eckhart has often said, which we'll get to next, about God as being itself. Esse est Deus. That was one of St. Eckhart's core maxims, and is one of my core maxims as well as a theologian. Esse est Deus. Being is God. Being is divine ground. So living, being, spirit, veriditas, and creative, all creative, right? Holding all creative capacity in the cosmos, a kind of dynamic energy of breath-giving, inspiriting life force, movement, flow. And this logos, she says, manifests in every creature. We could also say in every being. Creature in a technical sense being just something that's created, right? Manifests in every being. Similarly, just one quote down, or skipping one quote, and then we find St. Eckhart, every creature or every being, small b being, is a word of God and is a book about God. So I want to suggest to you that the implications of this shift in, let's call it normative Christian thinking, if we would accept such a shift or if we would entertain it, the implications are radical. Because often what is word logos? How is word discussed?
Text. Text, right?
Yeah, exactly. Word is scripture, it's text, or a little more broadly, it's a rational force, or a force of mentation that is somehow inspired and that gets translated into text, right? That's a very narrow understanding of logos, first of all. Secondly, it's a very Protestant understanding of logos. And I'm not here to lambast Protestants, but I may unwittingly do a little bit of that just in the course of my discourse, just because I think that so many of the gifts in the tradition that we have inherited as Christians are to be found in a pre-Protestant milieu. So that's my bias. I think it's warranted, but always open for discussion, and I certainly don't intend to offend or malign. But this notion of word, either way, as being something that's specifically related to a kind of cognitive unfoldment, right? And actually, if you go back before Christianity, one of the understandings of logos in Hellenistic philosophy, particularly in Stoicism, which was highly influential on developing Christianity, is as the kind of reason of the universe, the rational mind of the cosmos, which moves in and through mostly the human person, because the human person has the mental faculties to receive that movement or transmission or energy. So that's something that is present in Christianity to some degree from the beginning, but it's never, like in scripture, it's not defined at all, right? It's never overtly discussed in the way that we are discussing it now, or theologians have discussed it for thousands of years. It's just not done in scripture. So if you think about the beginning of John, the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Logos, right? And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Okay, but it doesn't tell you what the Logos is. It just says kind of where it is and when it is, but it doesn't really tell you what it is. And there are implications throughout John actually in multiple directions, which is a whole nother story, but that attempt to sort of define without defining, right? To sort of indirectly define what logos is, and obviously the writers of John, multitudinous as they were, wanted to indicate that the logos was uniquely connected to the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. But in terms of what logos is in a pre and post incarnate state, a pre and post incarnate state, ne'er a whisper, yeah, not discussed. Scholars like Sister Barbara Green and others who have looked really carefully at John, who are scriptural scholars, and I studied with Sister Barbara in Berkeley. She's quite a force. Assert that actually logos in many ways is a stand-in for Sophia, for wisdom, because there's this kind of, in and around the first century, there's this Hebraic notion circulating. Of course, it's older as well, but that the person, the divine person that is with God in the beginning, in other words, in creation in Genesis, is Hagia Sophia, the divine wisdom of God, the feminine counterpart of Yahweh. Okay. There are other interpretations of that, of the pluralistic nature of God's language, of Yahweh's language in that first chapter of Genesis. Let us create, right? You're all familiar with all that stuff. So there are, of course, many interpretations of that. Later, some Christians tried to read the Trinity as a whole into it, which is a contrivance and offensive to Jews. And so we don't want to do that. But there is this very deep-rooted Jewish notion that comes out of the wisdom schools of Judaism that we see expressed in Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus, etc., right? Song of Solomon, that suggests that the person that is with God is divine wisdom, who is a feminine personification of some divine principle, which we meet with in all of those texts in one form or another. Okay, so that's just a little background. So to suggest that the word, the logos, is akin to or is directly identifiable with divine wisdom and is living, breathing, constantly greening, making things alive, the one through whom all things are created, as we say in some of our Eucharistic prayers in Catholic Christian tradition, manifesting in every being or in every creature. That's a radical paradigm shift away from the word is something that we find in a book, right? It's God somehow rationally cogitating with, through, for, however you want to think of that, human persons, human minds, with all their enculturated trappings, etc., and ending up in a codified textual form as something that represents a unique transmission of the divine will. This is a very different paradigm. So I welcome your thoughts and reflections on that, your maybe reaction to that, your internal experience with it. And if you have things to say about that, let's unpack it a little bit. And if not, then we can just move on to what you guys think is worthy of discussion. Yeah,
Brendan,
John.
if I may.
Yeah.
I learned years ago, before I started teaching in Christian schools,
Yeah.
about kind of a threefold expression of the word. You know, the creative word, the word of creation, you know, the inscripturated word, and the word incarnate, Jesus Christ. So, you know, I don't even know the origin of that exactly, but it's kind of what I've lived and taught my whole life. So do you know a little bit more of the origin? I remember taking a biblical foundations of Christian education course from a fellow named Gordon Spikeman.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that rings a bell.
But, that name doesn't, and I, off the top of my head, I don't know the exact origins of that, but it sounds like something that would be commonly found even in Roman Catholic theology. I mean, like a Thomas Aquinas, for example, I could see investing in that kind of a structure. The creation part, interestingly, is something that has not been emphasized much in the West. And so it's more common, in my limited experience and understanding at least, it's more common to hear about word in more of a twofold expression, as the person and as the text. The adding creation would be more of a kind of early church move in a lot of ways. But I could see it occurring in the realm of Roman theology. I wonder if wonder if we can do a little Google search in like 30 seconds and find something on that. Yeah, I'm not getting anything immediately that looks promising as a possible origin for that. Here's a couple of just really brief, interesting historical points. That the first formal mention of the Logos outside of the Johannine scriptural literature, in other words, outside the Gospel of John and the Johannine letters, is from Ignatius, Saint Ignatius of Antioch. So Saint Ignatius says, there's one God who manifested himself by Jesus Christ, his son, who is his eternal word, not proceeding forth from silence. In other words, not created, but eternally extant, never created as a secondary being, which of course is a sticking point for a lot of early theological debate in the church, and caused all kinds of councils to be called and people to be excommunicated and whatnot. But so there, in that instance, Saint Ignatius says it's a very singular description. So in contrast to the model that you have, John, where it's a threefold model, for Saint Ignatius, it was pretty monofocal, right? It's just one thing. The word is only manifested in the person of Jesus Christ. So that's interesting to note, that a really early church attestation in that sort of Johannine lineage is defining it very narrowly. And this is like, all these kinds of questions when they come up are always so instructive, I think, in remembering that the early church, broadly speaking, let's say the first 4 or 5 centuries of Christianity, are so diverse. And we often think, because we're looking through a distorted lens at the history, we often think, oh, well, there was sort of this orthodox consensus that then over a long period of time kind of got parsed out and divided, and different opinions arose. Not so. I mean, that diversity was present from day one, from the very beginning. So that's helpful to remember too. It would be interesting to find other sources in early theology that talk more about a multiplicitous understanding of Logos, and that's something I can do a little research on if you guys are interested in that, and maybe share it with you next time. But thanks for bringing that up, John. I like that. I mean, it's a good, a good Trinitarian model, right?
Yeah, thank you. And I know I have a few texts that really that just don't come to mind right now. So I'll keep searching here.
Okay, sounds good. Other thoughts and reflections from folks on this?
Hi, this is Lamira. I wasn't able to make the first session, so I'm just kind of catching up.
Sure.
But you said
Welcome.
something interesting about and maybe I missed it, but I think you said something about the Trinity being inserted into Genesis when it says in the beginning, um, God created God was, or Christ was present in the beginning. That's something that I was taught in charismatic church, that when it says, let us make man in our own image, let us was Christ, God, the Holy Spirit, they're all there. And did I hear you correctly when you said that that's something that is disrespectful to the Jewish tradition? And if you said that, if that's what you meant, then I would love to know why, one, and then how did that interpretation come about,
Sure.
or how did that come about?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Good question. Well, I think that when the Judaism, in many ways, has been a victim of Christian history, right? I mean, we don't need to extrapolate on that. That's clear, I hope, to everyone. And so Jews tend to be rather sensitive about Christians in particular taking their holy text and reading something into it that they don't feel was actually ever there. So so the Trinity is a completely Christian notion. In fact, it actually, and maybe we can talk about this some other time, but in my view, it's actually something that derives from Gaulish, which is Celtic theology in the early centuries of the church, which has a pre-Christian Indo-European patrimony. It has nothing to do with Hebraic thought at all. There's no precedent in Judaism for a Trinity. So when Christians talk about reading the Trinity in Genesis 1, Jews tend to get, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I've talked to lots of Jewish folks, friends, scholars, etc., over the years about such things, and they tend to get offended by that because they feel like, well, this is our sacred text, and you're telling us how to interpret it, and you're doing so in a way or with a construct that is something you created, right? Not you're reading it into the text and it's not really there. But what I was also suggesting or sharing is that there is a long-standing Jewish tradition in certain schools of interpretation of reading divine wisdom into that plurality in Genesis. That is native to Jewish tradition, and that doesn't, at least from my experience, doesn't make Jews grumpy. But when you read the Trinity in, it tends to offend, or at least cause discomfort at some level. Is that helpful at all?
Very much, because
okay.
I never gave it any thought. But again, I'm coming out of a very charismatic evangelical tradition, so a lot of this is new to me, but deeply resonates. So that's very helpful.
Good. Thanks, Lamira. I think that one of the things that this raises too, which is just a personal passion of mine that's maybe worth naming, is interfaith dialogue. I think interfaith dialogue is so important. And when we isolate in silos, when we become too insular, then we shield ourselves from discourse with other outlooks on life. And man, that's such a detriment. I mean, not just in religion, but in the world in general. So let's pray for more of less siloing and more discourse, more open, free discourse. And relationship, that's the other thing too, is sometimes, people think, oh, interfaith dialogue, or within Christianity, ecumenism, that's about sort of dialoguing or exchanging in ideas between different traditions. But I think more than that, it's about relationship. Like you can't really understand what somebody else's cultural or religious perspective is until you show up authentically and engage that person or that group in real relationship at a human level, not as an anthropologist or someone in there trying to extract all the fat out of them, but just as a human person. That's so important. So anyway,
I did find a couple of verses. I put them in the chat, which have really been informative for me. Exodus 35, where it speaks of God giving the skills to various craftspeople to build the temple, which is, very much his creative word working through the skills of people to do wonderful things in real practical ways. And the other one in Isaiah 28, it starts with saying, listen and hear my voice. Pay attention and hear what I say. When a farmer plows for planting, does he plow continually? And it just talks about a farmer just learning from practicing his profession, what creation is saying to him as far as ways of wisdom, ways of God's word being expressed in creation. So anyway, those are a couple that have been very informative to me.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting that something else that raises is the issue of translation and of Old and New Testaments. And remember that the Hebraic scriptures, either in Latin as the Vulgate or in Greek as the Septuagint, are translations, right, out of the Hebrew. And the Hebrew doesn't have the word logos. That's a Greek word. Verbum in Latin, okay? And I think the word that generally gets translated out of Hebrew as either verbum or logos, and then in yet another translative iteration into English as word, is the word dabar. And that word does not contain all of the accretions of the word logos, which we find in the Gospel of St. John or anywhere in the New Testament. It's a different word. So making a connection between dabar, which is a Hebrew concept in a Hebraic language, and logos, which is very much a Hellenistic concept in Hellenistic language, and which brings with it this massive history long before Christianity, a Hellenistic history of philosophical usage in many different ways and all the rest of it, right? To try to equate those things is, let's just say, problematic, to be simple and somewhat diplomatic about it. That's a problematic endeavor. And maybe there's fruit in that. But again, I think with those kinds of interpretive moves, we find ourselves in a difficult position as Christians reading into what amounts to someone else's sacred body of text, something that the authors and inheritors of that sacred body of text did not put there. And of course, I know this is, in some circles, it's controversial to even say these things, because a lot of Christians will say, well, what do you mean? The Old Testament is ours just as much as the New Testament is ours, right? And I understand that that's what people think and feel and how they're raised, and I'm sympathetic to that. And at the same time, if you ask Jews, who are the custodians of those Hebraic texts and the rightful ancestral inheritors of those texts, they will say not remotely. So then it's an interesting question of who decides, right? Who decides? Who has the authority to decide who those texts, quote, belong to, and what they mean and what they really say? And I think anytime we're looking at a language, it's not our own, whatever it is, we're already in hot water, right? We're already on an uphill climb, and we've got a lot of work ahead of us if we approach it authentically and adequately and realistically. If we think that's just an easy endeavor and no big deal, don't need to think twice about it, then we're gravely wrong. So just some further thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I wonder, Aaron here, and I wonder too a little bit, in the same breath of God being, or that Dunbar sort of concept, creative energy. Writing is a very creative process, and as are the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I think that although I would concede that the Jewish people, tradition has sort of the mechanics and the custodians of those scriptures, I wouldn't say they have the only right to interpretation of those scriptures. I think the creative energy goes beyond their tradition, and that has allowed people from all different faith traditions, including Christianity, to explore those scriptures and glean that creative energy from those scriptures. So I would just, I guess, just my thought there is that although the Jewish people maybe have sort of the custodian piece, I wouldn't say that their interpretation is the only interpretation. That is a very human construct, and I think looking at it much more openly, I think there is more room for interpretation there.
Yeah, I think that's a totally valid reading of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's like I said, I think it's a question, not there. I don't know there's a real final answer to it, but I think it's an alive, poignant question to ask. Who decides, right? Yeah. And I think it's interesting if we think of the notion of the word and wisdom, kind of staying with that early Christian tradition of equating those two things. If we think of that in a truly Catholic sense, which just means universal, right? Then it's something that expands beyond cultural boundaries and human historical time as we measure it. It's transcends all of that. And I think that's a very good point that you made in that regard. And we could even say then, and this will take us maybe back to some of the texts that Fox is highlighting here, that if we follow that out to its logical conclusion, then the expansion that we're engaged in takes us not just beyond cultural, time-bound constructs, but in some way maybe takes us beyond human interpretation altogether, beyond human fabrications, beyond translations, beyond all of it, right? I mean, how can we measure and think seriously that we're able to adequately interpret something that is part of the movement of divine energy, which is a capital M mystery that it seems to me anyway that the rational faculties of the human mind can't even begin to truly approach in the way that we would like to. Right? I'm not saying the human person can't approach it or stand in the light of that presence, but the mind, the rational mind, generally gets in the way of that connection rather than enhances it. So just an additional thought there.
Yeah, no, I would go with that. I would follow that thought as well. I did have another comment or question. And just as I was reading through this, thinking about, and I've wrestled with this in my own sort of experience of faith, my faith experience, as well as, the idea of God being kind of within everything and this kind of creative energy, and as being, I think, very Like, I really believe that to be a huge part of, of God's being. And the question being, and maybe this was, in Jesus becoming sort of one of us, maybe bridges that, but we as human beings cannot deny the importance of relationship, and a relationship not to a nebulous sort of ether, but a real relationship with friends and families and neighbors, like that sort of kind of relationship, which being I think a created part of who we are, and I would argue one of the most important parts. We are communal and social beings. That how does that creative being, and maybe it is just through Jesus becoming one of us, how does that, God and that creative energy, that Dunbar, then relate to that part of who we are as human beings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the relational aspect of what it means to be human, I think, is something that has maybe too frequently been exiled from conversations on theology in terms of the relational dimensions of what it means maybe to be divine. And there are some mystics, not just in Christianity but in other traditions as well, who have asserted that God's reason for creation is relationship, right? And so if we talk, we've been talking off and on this evening about John because of the Logos connection and the sort of Johannine witness, and I wonder about the fruits of that with relation to St. John's notion of God as love. And we could think of that. There are many ways to unpack that, and we couldn't do it here tonight, but worth doing over a lifetime. But one thing that just occurs to me now, based on what you were saying, Aaron, is that love as an impulse for life itself, capital L, or for the ground of being, if we want to use that Descartesian phraseology, is about relationality. One beingness, or one capital B being, if we're talking about the divine, cannot be in relationship in isolation. In order for there to be relationality, there must be division, there must be other, there must be two-ness, at least, right? Multiplicity. And if God is an eternal self-contained isness with no expression beyond just this sort of monistic morass of being, then there's no possibility of relationality, and therefore there's no possibility of love or of compassion, if we want to think of it that way. Same thing in effect, right? So that relational piece, I think, is really crucial in any conversation in the realm of theology. But as I said, often in the past it's been left out when talking about the nature of God, except sometimes some theologians have talked about it in terms of the Trinity. Like within the Trinitarian structure, there's a relational dynamic, right? That the reason that it's three and one and not just one is because three makes way for relationality. That's been talked about in theology. But this idea that maybe God's whole raison d'etre is relationship, and hence creation, that's often been overlooked except by the mystics. And I think that's something that's really worth bringing to the fore for discussion.
Well, thank you for that response. That was great.
I don't want to take us too far afield, but and maybe we're not ready for that. But I would love to have a conversation about the whole notion of original sin, and this notion that we were born bad, born in a bad world. And I'm reading here from page 42 with I had to take my glasses off. I'm that old. Herbert Haig, is that correct? Who says the doctrine of original sin is not found in any of the writings of the Old Testament. It is certainly not in chapters 1 to 3 of Genesis.
Mhm.
And I think most of us, at least on this Zoom call here, probably grew up under the doctrine of original sin and then the cascading activity of atonement and penal substitution and all the things that
Yeah.
derive from that. Can you speak to that just from your background in this Alexandrian tradition potentially, and or your tradition of original goodness versus original sin?
Mhm. Well, I don't want to rehash too much of what we talked about last time, because we spent a lot of time on the Augustinian framework and all of that stuff last time. But I mean, I'll just say that I think that's a very unfruitful mode of theology. And, it's really primarily attributable to St. Augustine. And as it developed in Western history, because it was really not accepted in the East by Christians in the East for the most part, but as it developed in Western history, it took on all kinds of ravenous forms and was something that was very much favored by Protestants in the Reformation era, particularly Luther. I mean, I find it so corrosive that I and I don't want to hit too hard on it. I don't want to hammer too hard on it. But I find that way of doing theology and that way of thinking and seeing the world so counterproductive that I think really that, this is one of the things where the places where I actually take issue with Matthew Fox. There are others, believe me, this isn't the only one, but one of the places where I take issue with his work, at least in this book, is that he qualifies rejecting that Augustinian construct of original sin and total depravity and all the rest of it. He qualifies a rejection of that by saying that, maybe we just need to kind of give that approach its right place. And I find that to be a very weak-willed approach, because so much is at stake if we allow those kinds of what I would consider to be toxic ideologies to persist, because they have a major stake in the destruction of the world, not just the human world, but the totality of the world in an ecological sense. And those aren't the only causal factors. I'm not saying all of our problems go back to this one theological point. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that. But these kinds of ideas have played such a major role in the development of corrosive patterns of behavior and discourse among human persons in the Western world that I think the only meaningful thing we can do in response to them is cut them out like a cancer. For God's sake, get rid of it. Now, you were asking Gary Allen about, what the Alexandrian tradition maybe would say about this, and maybe what we in our community would say about it, or I'm not sure exactly what the scope of your question was, but if Saint Hildegard and Saint Eckhart here say soothe, right, on page 35, and the divine presence and the Logos, the word and wisdom of God, is moving and breathing in all things and all beings. That means us, and it means every being. And that's kind of what I mentioned earlier, that if Christians are open to that and willing to embrace that shift of perception, it's a radical paradigm shift. Right? And so I think part of what's at issue, and how, like, my theological inheritance, lineage, orientation, etc., would differ strongly, is from not only seeing creation as originally good in a sort of Genesis-based way, like in the beginning, creation came into being, it was good, all that stuff, that's there too. But more than that, the divine presence itself is within and all around us. It's spread out across the entirety of creation. It's just that we don't recognize it. And that failure to recognize the truth of divinity is our, quote, fallen state. That's our brokenness. That's the egoic, self-centered, delusional error, the core error. There are other errors too, but that's sort of the core root error that must be healed, must be corrected. And the path of atonement, the Christian path of spiritual life toward theosis, is one of holing, making whole, restitution, at one-ment. And at one-ment, in the deepest sense, I think, means restoring the original vision, right? The vision of the garden. What's the original vision is, there is no separation, right? That's the original vision of creation in the garden. And so to get back to that state, I think is really let me say this, that's one metaphorical way we can talk about the goal of Christian life being theosis, deification, union with God. And there are other ways that we can talk about it too that are also fruitful. But if we use that metaphor of the garden, then there's a beautiful set of sayings in St. Thomas's Gospel, a non-canonical, very early gospel text that, if you're not familiar with, I highly recommend that you make yourselves familiar with, which says that this little group of sayings has a common motif, and that motif suggests that we have to go back to the first day. Again, this is a metaphor related to the mythos of the garden, going back to the way of seeing that was represented in or experienced in the first day of creation. And that way of seeing in the first day is a way that is without division. It's a way of seeing that only sees unity. It sees through the divine eyes, because in the divine perception, there's only unity. But in the multiplicitous perception of fallen or sinful human persons that are in error of perception, there's always division, there's always multiplicity. So the essence of this process of at one-ment is exactly what it sounds like. And it's about non-duality. It's about attaining to a non-dual view, to see with the divine eyes. You know, Saint Eckhart has this amazingly beautiful phrase where he says, the eyes through which I see God and the eyes through which God sees me are one and the same. Meditate on that one for a while. That's a profound invitation from Saint Eckhart. And there are many of these spirit-inspired road signs in the tradition, pointing us to what's really at stake and what's really at issue, and what this whole journey is really about, you know. So that's in our community and in a kind of our inheritance as inheritors of this Alexandrian and Thomasine milieu of theology, of non-dual Christian mystical theology. That's how we would approach that question, Gary Allen. I know it's a little bit circuitous, but I hope it's useful. So let me ask, what other things came up for you guys? Oh, by the way, flag me if I'm over time. Are we over time?
No, I was planning on us going to 7:30. So if anyone needs
Okay.
to drop off before then, that's no problem. But we'll be around till 7:30.
Okay, great. So I wanted to just open up to you all again and ask, you know, looking either at theme 1, or maybe we could move into theme 2. Were there other things that stood out to you that you wanted to discuss, related to anything in the text, or anything that came up for you as you were reading? Right at the top, here's good old Saint Hildy again. Love Saint Hildy. Coming in with another whammy. God is the good, and all things which proceed from him are good. That's the baseline affirmation of the original goodness, or as Matthew Fox puts it, the original blessing of creation, right? Which is the foundation of our beingness, not error. So this is a difference, a major difference in these different schools that we're talking about, very broadly defined in this case. The error is not the foundation, as St. Augustine would say. I would say the error, and much of Orthodox theology would also say this, by the way, that the error is an add-on. It's an obfuscation. It's mud on the windshield, right? That's the sin. That's the hamartia, what causes us to miss the mark. Missing the mark is not our nature. Our nature is good, like Saint Hildegard says. The foundation, how could God emanate, create, produce things that are inherently broken? That's just a question for reflection. I think that if you reflect adequately on that question, you will come to a place of profound interior dissonance. And that's good. That's where you want to be, right? You want to get to that place of interior dissonance where you feel displaced and it doesn't make sense and all of that, because the truth is, it is nonsensical. Not just rationally, but intuitively, spiritually, metaphysically, it's nonsensical, right? But you have to live into that. You can't, just me saying it is useless. You have to really go deeply into that for yourself and find out. And that's a door opening. That's a door opening. So, and a blessed door and a needful door. So anyway, right out of the gate, again, Saint Hildy, Mama Hildy. There are some gems in here. Just looking at the beginning of theme 2, that with the quotes that Matthew Fox has curated. I mean, this quote by Auden is just such a jewel, man. As a rule, it was the pleasure haters who became unjust. That's classic. That's so good. I mean, it's so true. I mean, think about Puritanism. It's just this. It's the people who do injustices are so often the people who are self-tortured, repressed, self-negating, self-hating, hating creation, hating themselves, hating what they think is their own nature, which is not their own nature. All that stuff. And then it's really easy to do injustices from that place, right? Then everything is broken and a throwaway, and you might as well just tear up the earth and extract all the raw resources and enslave people and commit pogroms and everything else. It doesn't matter. It's all a wash, So this is what, why I say, I think these things that we're talking about theologically have great and grave implications, and they need to be redressed in a decisive way.
And I very much resonated with some of those biblical passages on page 45. The Deuteronomy and Genesis passages about God's people going to inhabit a land and be fruitful, be creative, be productive. And God was with them. They were co-creating with God. Beautiful mandates for human activity. So I very much appreciated this chapter as well.
Yeah, good.
So practically speaking, since this is such a paradigm shift, I know, from a more fundamentalist evangelical shift, practically speaking, can you give an example of what one can do? I mean, obviously, these wonderful quotes meditating on and reflecting on St. Hildegard and Mr. Eckhart. What would you encourage one to do practically to begin taking on this idea of original blessing? Creation is good and it's not bad.
Mm-hmm.
One example. I'm sure there's many, but what is a good starting point?
Yeah, just a minor question, sister. Well, I think you can and should share some of your own thoughts about that and your own insights, which I know you have. I mean, I'll just say this, and then I would genuinely like for you to share some of what you've discovered and what you teach as being valuable in that regard too. But I think one really good basic starting point is develop a meditation practice. Now, get out of the noise of the constantly distracted mind, which is just eating itself alive continuously with just mostly useless thinking, some useful, but majority useless. And even the useful thinking, so often, if we don't have a practice regularly, daily, that helps us clarify the water, so much of even the practically useful thinking is still muddy to one degree or another. It's like there's this wonderful saying that I have often quoted because I think it's so instructive. It's a little story from the Desert Mothers and Fathers. And for those of you who don't know, these are very early monastics, the founders of Christian monasticism, in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries mostly. And there's a beautiful story about 3 brothers who each decide that they want to try to find the truth in Christian life. Okay. And they decide that there are 3 different methodologies they can try, and each one of them will take up a different of those 3 methodologies, and they'll go their separate ways and see how it all pans out, right? One goes into healing practice, goes forth to heal people. Another goes to serve the poor. And the 3rd brother retires to a cave or a hermitage in the desert and takes up the contemplative life. And the first 2 brothers, they toil each in their own respective arenas, and years go by, and they come together and visit again with each other, and they say, how have you fared? And they both say, brother, I've slaved away, I have given myself 110% to this endeavor, and I still don't know truth. I'm not any closer to knowing truth or to knowing God. So they say, well, let's go find our other brother. And it takes them a long time to find him because he's in the wilderness, And they finally hear, by asking around and whatnot, they figure out where his cell is. And they go and they find him, and they ask him the same question: how have you fared? And he invites them to come in, and he, in his little simple cave, with just, a mud floor, and he has this one little table, and he takes a clay bowl and he puts some water in it, and he takes up a hand of sand, kind of muddy sand, and he throws it into the bowl, and he sets it on the table, and he says, my dear brothers, look now at this bowl and tell me what you see. And they both say, well, I see water that is very muddy, and there's silt stirring around, and it's unclear. It's not possible to see the bottom of the bowl. And he says, very good. Now wait a little longer. And they sit there in silence for a while. And he says, now, brothers, tell me what you see. And they say, well, now we see water that is slightly less turbulent, slightly less muddy, a little more clear, but we still can't see the bottom. And the 3rd brother says, very good. Now let's wait a while longer. So they sit there for a good time in silence. And finally, the 3rd brother says again, tell me now what you see. And the first 2 brothers look, and they say, it's clear. The water is clear. And the 3rd brother says, even so, brothers, until you retire into the great interior silence and the noise of the mind settles, you will never find clarity, and you will never see truth. You won't see truth in yourself or in anything else until you have given the time and effort to allow that silt of the mind to settle. So how can we, and this is how this relates to your question, sister, specifically about how to open ourselves to the goodness of creation more. How, if we can't think clearly enough, or see clearly enough, more importantly, perceive, feel clearly enough to intuitively experience ourselves as interconnected with all other beings, and we can't think clearly, all we're doing is thinking about our own minuscule, worthless problems, moment after moment, hour after hour, day after day. How can we have real compassion? How can we know what love is? And how can we be open, truly open? The answer is we can't. So I think step one has to be, or should be, finding that, what we call in monastic tradition, hesychia, that profound inner stillness in the heart, which takes time and effort. It's not going to come overnight, but to develop a meditation practice or a contemplative practice of some sort to access that clarity, so that some of the mud on the windshield is wiped away. And then we will feel more accurately or more acutely what is real. We'll feel it at an intuitive level. We'll feel what we're doing to the earth collectively. We'll feel our own sin, right? Our own stupidity, our own arrogance and ignorance. We'll feel that, not just think about it as an idea, but we'll feel it profoundly. And there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. And then there will be transformation. As long as we're stuck in the mud, to use the bowl metaphor again, we're stuck in that place where all we see is cloudiness. And that's all we know, because that's all we've ever experienced, is just clouded mind, nonsense, chaos that we think is normal. We just take it for granted. As long as we're stuck in that place, how can we ever hope to see anything clearly? Not even ourselves, let alone our connection to the rest of life or anything about God. Forget it. So that's my answer in short, as a good step one. Now I think you should tell us about maybe step 2 or 3.
Thanks for putting me on the spot.
It's
No,
part of what
one
I'm here to do,
I know. Um, yes, I mean, 100% agree, of course. Starting to integrate into your life that stillness, um, and the settling of the mud. And it's a process, just as the images came with the story that you told. Um, while those who went out to heal and do the outward actions, they were all good things, but that's only part. And
Yeah.
until you do the interior work, until you begin to take on contemplative practices, and I, for one, can attest to that. Our family can attest to that. The more that we make it a habit and a discipline in our daily lives to carve out, and it looks different for each one of us, particularly in our family, just to use an example, the more that we do it, the clearer the waters become. And while our actions are good, for myself, teaching, for Gary Allen in particular, doing Sophia Society, these are all outward expressions, and they're all good. But unless we're doing that interior work of being still, it's not complete. It's not full, and it's not transformative. Um, and practically speaking, I mean, I could give a couple of examples of how I do that. I know within our community, that Father Brennan and I are in his community, that we take on a certain expression of practicing these things. But one thing that I can find in particular is being out in nature, being one with creation, and just attuning your senses. That's one practical example of trying to still your mind, and just being in tune with the creation that is here, to be in relationship with. And that's just a practice. I mean, just when you can, take a 15-minute walk, and begin that practice. And it is a process. It is a process. Um, and it's not easy, especially, we have to shed so much of the noise, the cacophony that is constantly going on, and all of the distractions. And believe me, I mean, I've got 3 kids, and a job, and so many things going on. But I 100% agree that until we begin to do that, we're only partially able to be transformed. The outward expression isn't going to be in its fullest, and you're not going to be transformed unless that interior practice is taking place. So, yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Blessed Thomas Merton says that, I think very astutely, he says that unless the person who seeks to do the work of justice or transformation in the outward realms of life, unless that person is first a contemplative, they will only unwittingly, not by their own ill intent, but unwittingly, they will only in the end bring more mischief and violence. Because what they're doing, it's not that it's good, it's needful, like you just said, sister. It's extremely needful, the outward work in the world. But if someone isn't clear inside, internally, then the work that they're doing, it might be a violence to themselves, because then it wouldn't be sustainable if they're not clear and healthfully detached from results and all these things that come with a contemplative orientation to living. But it might also be unwittingly doing violence to others, sort of unwittingly sowing seeds of mischief where one is attempting to sow seeds of healing and wholeness. That can happen. I'm not saying universally that's the reality, but that, I think, regularly happens in the world. I think Merton's observation there is very sound. And even in the natural world, right? Like John was mentioning this too in the chat I saw, and I 100% agree. Get into the natural world and immerse yourself and let go of the noise of the human-made world, and remember what's really real, not your insurance policy and your whatever, bank account and all your problems, most of which are fabricated. No, that's not real. What's real is the dew settling on the oak leaves, and the mist and the wind and all those things, and the sort of raw, radiant activity of natural life. That's real, at least in a provisional way. I'm not even saying capital R real. I'm just saying small r real. That's real, right? When I talk capital R real, that's another discussion. But then we're into the non-dual again. But just provisionally real in the realm of appearances. All of our human fabricated problems are not real. It's just nonsense. So reminding ourselves through that immersion of what's real is extremely valuable. But even in that, if we're not clear, we can do harm, right? Because then we want to say, oh, well, let's cordon off this area because this is such a great place where people can come and experience beauty, and then let's commodify it, right? So even in trying to do something good, we can still do violence, we can do harm, we can further obfuscate rather than make clear if we don't first make clear what's in our own hearts and minds. So yes to everything that's been said by you, sister, and by John also, and also to what was said by Blessed Thomas Merton. Any final reflections anybody has? I know we're coming near to the close here. Yeah, I'm just looking at page 46 and remembering that Matthew Fox has a bit about this too, similar to what I was saying about the violence that these ideologies can do, these corrosive ideologies like the Augustinian construction of original sin and all the rest. And he says, there's a genuine scandal involved in this dangerous distortion of life and of biblical data. I think that's a really salient point. So anyway, that's my last thing for this evening. So any final words from all of you, I welcome, or Gary Allen, as you wish, you can wrap things up. But
Yeah, anybody else? And we'll close. This has been incredible, actually. I think I've taken 3 pages of notes. So thank you, Father Brendan. Thank you for your wisdom and for your candor and for your grace and for opening up just a different way of seeing the world, the literal world that we live in. So I know John has had to step off. Caitlin has had to step off. Amira, it's great to see you again. Matt, where's Megan? Do you not let her come this time?
She was listening for a while and then she bailed out, but
Okay.
she was off camera right here,
All right.
taking it all in.
Great. Well, thank you guys. Father Brendan, thank you again. We will commence the 4th Thursday of December, which I'm not even going to do the math right now, but we'll whatever that date is. I think it's like the 20 something, but I'll send out that Zoom, and John and Jackie was listening and crocheting offline as well. So really honored that you all would join us and be here. Thank you so much. I know this is a deep dive into some really intense stuff, and but that's why Father Brendan's here, and that's why I am not leading it. I am learning as well. So I hope to see you guys next time. And if you have other friends and family that are a part of our community, please invite them as well. We don't want this to be exclusive, but yet we also have made this for our friends and patrons to give you a little bit of an extra sense of formation for your contribution and for your kindness and friendship to us. But we also want to invite others. So if you have someone that you just think, gosh, they really need to be here, let me know. I'll send them the Zoom link as well. We want to be open-handed in all that we do. So for us in America, have a great Thanksgiving. For those in Canada, Jackie and John, have a great evening. I hear you're dealing with some storms and a lot of rain. So be safe and be well. And we'll see you next time. How about that? All right.
thank you all.
Guys. Thanks,
God's
Father
peace.
Brendan.
Bye, everyone.